every week we start off by introducing Carl, who is extremely well known to many, many people, but obviously we want to make sure that any newcomers know who Carl is. So I'm going to read off some information about his bio. And before I do that, just a 2-minute introduction of why we're doing these Facebook Live sessions. So Kinetics are a recruitment company. We have been bringing international nurses to the US for many, many years. We work with direct hire facilities all over the US, and both acute care hospitals, nursing homes, skilled nursing, long-term care, surgery centers. The list goes on and on. We have never been busier, which is a good sign, because according to the American Association of Nurses, there is going to be a shortage of 1 million registered nurses, new positions for registered nurses by 2022, which is an enormous number. And if you think that we're almost at the end of this year, 2022 is around the corner. So many facilities these days are looking at nurses as an alternative supplement to augment what they're already doing in terms of their retention and recruitment of their current recruitment of nurses. So with that said, I'm going to read off some information about Carl, and then we can get to the questions at hand. Today, we're going to be discussing the TN. I have a little cough, Carl, so you'll just have to bear with me today.
Okay.
Okay, so immigration attorney Carl Schusterman has over 40 years of experience practicing immigration law. He served as a trial attorney for the U.S. Immigration and Naturalization Service from 1976 until 1982, when he entered the private practice of law. He's one of the very limited number of attorneys who've been designated as certified specialists in immigration and naturalized law by the California State Bar. For more than 10 years, he's been voted as one of the best lawyers in America and as a super lawyer by his colleagues at the bar. He was featured in February 2018 issue of Super Lawyers magazine. He has been named as one of the top 15 corporate immigration attorneys in the US by Human Resources Executive magazine. His hard work and dedication to immigration law has earned him the highest rating in legal abilities and ethics from the prestigious Martindale-Hubbell Legal Directory. He has served as a member of the Immigration and Nationality Law Advisory Commission for the State Bar. Carl is also listed in the International Who's Who of Corporate Immigration Lawyers and the Chamber's U.S. Guide for Leading Business Lawyers. Carl has testified as an expert witness on temporary visas and green cards for registered nurses before the Senate Immigration Subcommittee in Washington, D.C. So, very impressive, Carl.
Thank you.
As I always say, we know now that you are the real deal, and we look forward to picking your brains and getting more information from you on nurse immigration.
I'm here to help.
Okay, good. So the first question that I'm going to ask is about the TN. So today we've asked excuse me, forgive me for, I needed some water. We've asked a lot of questions about the TN. And today we have some additional questions about the TN so that we can finish this topic and then move on to other topics, because we have a lot of nurses that are sending us questions for you to answer. And I want to make sure that we get everybody's questions answered. So if you want to give us a 2-second summary again for those people who missed the previous sessions on the TN, what is the TN and how is that applicable for registered nurses? And then we can get to the questions.
So the U.S. is in a trade agreement. We have been for several years with Canada and Mexico. And if you're a citizen of Canada or Mexico and you are a registered nurse, although frankly, you don't have to be a registered nurse in Canada or Mexico. You could have got your nurse license in your own country. And obviously, you'll need to get a license in whatever state you'll be practicing in. But you can come to the US. The TN stands for Trade NAFTA. The NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement. It's actually has a new name as of a few weeks ago, but they're still calling the visas a TN. And And just to be clear, Canadians actually don't need a visa. So the process is so fast that you can come to the airport an extra hour early, have the TN stamped at your passport, and come into the US and start working. I don't think there's another type of visa that I've worked for, that I've worked with over the last 40 years that you can get in an hour or two. Usually takes weeks or months to do so.
So out of all the visas that are applicable for an RN, this one is the quickest. Absolutely. And the least expensive.
Absolutely, yes.
And I want to welcome everybody today. We have quite a lot of viewers already. Welcome Naz, welcome Vanessa. So let's get to the questions at hand. All right, so what happens if you are on a TN and you get laid off? What would happen then? Because obviously you've got to be, look, it's unlikely to happen to a nurse, but it is something that might come up. I mean, there was a hospital that we were working with a little while ago that closed down. I mean, it does happen. So what would happen in that situation in terms of the TN?
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've had this happen a few times. It's not always laid off. Sometimes the nurse just wants to switch employers. Sometimes the nurse is laid off. Basically, the nurse needs to find a new employer to sponsor her for the TN, goes up to Canada. It's as quick as having lunch in Canada and coming back to the airport. And then they stamp you in with a TN for the new company, and you can start working for them. So it's really not a problem.
So it's again just starting the process in the same way as was done for the original visa, for the original TN.
Right. It's really identical, except if the nurse got the TN in the first place, the usual waiting things for the TN are on the nurse's side. When we talk to a nurse, I'll say, do you have the visa screen? And she won't have it yet. Or do you have a license to practice in a particular state? And she'll say it's pending, or the English exam. But if you already have a TN from employer A, that means you have the license, you have the English test, you have the visa screen. You just need another job offer as a nurse and go up to the border, come down with the new TN.
But the danger, Carl, in some instances, and we did have one nurse, her name was Samantha, that had this situation, and she didn't realize that she would have to go back to Canada, so she stayed in the US. And she said she didn't, it was like maybe like 2 months. What happens in that case? Because is she then like out of status?
Right. So if you lose your job, I mean, a TN is tied to the employer, although you can switch employers, but you need to get a new TN for the new employer. So if you just stop working, or you go to the beach or Disneyland, or it takes you a few weeks to find a new job, you are out of status during that time. So what we prefer to do, if it's going to take a while, usually with nurses, they can get a new job within a couple days. We represent so many hospitals, we're often able to help these nurses do it pretty fast. But if a nurse, does want to take a little vacation, or thinks it's going to take a while before hospital B gets back to her about whether they're going to employ her, what we like to do is ask for a change of status. That's where we file a form with the Immigration Service and say, we want to change this TN nurse's status from TN to B2. B2 is a tourist or a visitor visa, and Canadians are also exempt from that visa, but we do a change of status. Frankly, we won't even get an answer because that'll be pending for months. But while it's pending, the nurse keeps her legal status, and then when she goes back to the border and comes back, it's much easier. If a nurse is out of legal status for 2 months, somebody at the border, my old employer there, the Customs and Border Protection, it was called the INS back when I worked for them. But they're not lawyers, and they may be scratching their heads like, well, the nurse has broken the immigration law by staying in the US for 2 months. do we really trust her to maintain TN status? So it's really important that nurses have somebody that they can call. All of our nurses, if it's a simple matter like that, they'll call Elsa Garcia, who's our chief senior paralegal for nurses, who's been working with me on TNs and other nurses for over 20 years. And if it's a legal question, then Elsa will just buzz me and I'll get on the phone with the nurse and we'll advise her on the same day, because we don't want anybody to get their immigration status messed up. It's kind of a complicated thing, immigration law. And, you know, I don't think most nurses, this is not a put down, or, you know, any more qualified to give themselves legal advice than I would be giving myself medical advice.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think there's also been a lot of changes from the immigration perspective over the last, even just the last year or two. So it's hard for any layperson to keep up.
My newsletter, by the way, I think I've said this on a couple of our previous Facebook Lives, but, you know, what we're saying is totally up to date for today. But for you, those of you who are watching this video in a week, in a month, 6 months from now, things are changing very rapidly in immigration law. And people ask me, well, how do I keep up with this? We've been putting out something called Schusterman's Immigration Update. It's a monthly newsletter. It's free, so it's definitely worth the price. You just go onto our webpage at schusterman.com, scroll down and look on the right side, and it says subscribe to our free newsletter. And it's all about immigration, everything from the waiting times to how to get different types of visas, but basically on the things that have been updated in the last month. And this one will come out on Monday. And it's incredible. I mean, I had to pick 6 different things to update and put links to the government pages. Wow. Because there were probably about 20 really significant things that happened this month. And I just had to pick the 6 most important, or all my readers would go to sleep if I put 20 of these things up there. So I urge everybody, we have about 60,000 subscribers to our newsletter. Including the HR people from all the hospitals that we represent and that I've talked to over the last 40 years. So might be even a good way to connect with people at hospitals. Yeah.
So definitely a very good resource, because it is a changing picture all the time. It's not going to stop changing.
No,
so it's very important for people to keep abreast of all of these amendments and all these modifications.
Absolutely, yes.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting, because this week I actually did a webinar for a whole lot of new clients who are now looking at international nurses as a way, as another strategy, and creating a pipeline of international nurses. And they were just saying that it's so confusing and it seems so complicated. And they, you know, were just, and that was just kind of like the basics. So, you know, it is unfortunately not an easy process. And that's really the purpose of these Facebook Live sessions, is to spread information. So please share these Facebook Live sessions with any of your friends or colleagues. Anybody in the Facebook Live session now. So Naz, Vanessa, Rolando, please share these Facebook Live sessions, because, you know, there is a lack of information about this and how it pertains to nurses. And really, that's the main purpose of why we do this, and why we want to make sure that people are educating themselves about the process. Okay, so the next question that we want to ask is about applying for, when you go into the when you go to the port of entry, whether it's an airport or driving across the border, what are some of your tips and pointers for nurses who are going through that process?
Well, number one, you will have a letter from the hospital or the healthcare provider that's going to employ you in the U.S. Tip number one is, since you're right, the fees are lower for TN than another type of visa, but still, the hospital and the nurse have to pay for this. So it used to be we could only get TNs for a year at a time. And a few years ago, it changed. So it's 3 years at a time. So number one, make sure your employer in their letter says they have a 3-year job for you, because who wants to keep paying and go back and forth across the border every year to do this when they can give you 3 years? Number two, TNs are supposed to have no intention of staying permanently in the US, although, frankly, a lot of our TN nurses, after they work in the US for a while, they decide, well, this is a lot warmer than Canada, or we like our job better in the US than we did in Canada. Whatever it happens to be, certain communities, like a lot of nurses are from the Philippines, and there's huge Philippine communities in California and some of the other states, and they want to be with their sister, with their brother, whatever. But when the CBP officer, the immigration officer at the airport, asks you, do you have any intention of staying permanently? If you would actually say yes, they may stop you and say, forget it. A TN is only for people who want to go back to Canada. So you just have to say, no, I'm coming for this 3-year job and possibly for an extension, if I like it. But if you start talking about permanent, you're just not going to get into the country. Mm-hmm. If you're down in the US for a few months and then you decide, wow, I want to stay here, well, you can do that, but it shouldn't be your intention when you cross the border.
Okay, so that's important. That's very important for people to note, because I think sometimes what happens is that when you cross the border, then the nurse gets nervous. Mm-hmm. And starts, volunteering all kinds of information. And really, my understanding is that, the officers at the border are really just trying to evaluate, is this a real job? And are you a real nurse? And that's where, in my experience, it's just answer the questions honestly and simply.
Right. Yeah. You want to answer. I think that's exactly right. I mean, so you definitely want to tell the truth. Number two, keep your answers short. They have a lot of work to do, these CBP officers. And if you go off on a whole story, one, they may get a little irritated, and two, you're going to use up a lot of their time, which they're not going to appreciate. And three, although it doesn't usually happen at the border, if some officer decides he wants to be sort of a prosecutor or something, he'll try to catch the applicant for the visa in some contradiction. So if they ask you, like, on what day of the week did you become a nurse, 3 years ago, and you don't know 100%, and I don't know what day of the week I became an attorney in 1973, that's for sure. Just say, I don't remember, that was a long time ago. Don't try to guess. You're not on Jeopardy, the quiz show. You're just answering questions honestly.
Yeah. So being honest, but keep your answers to the point. And just remember that they just, the officers are just trying to do their job, and they're just trying to make sure that it's a real job. And as I say, you're a real nurse, which, you are. Right. So there shouldn't be any issues with that. We have a question from Tribus Dizon. Hi, Carl. Do you think the EB3 visa will begin to slow down tremendously for the 2018 visa bulletin? And hi to Margot.
Okay, so we already have the November visa bulletin up. It comes out in the middle of the month in October. And also Charlie Oppenheim, who I've known for many years, he's the person at the US State Department who puts together the visa bulletin every month. It's a matter of supply and demand. There's only a certain amount of green cards they can give out every year. It's 140,000. And they have so many more people applying that certain countries, especially India and China, have years-long waits. The only other country that has any kind of wait as far as the employment categories is the Philippines, and only in the EB3 category. I'm going to cough too, so excuse me.
Catching my cough.
Yeah, I'm catching it. I mean, San Diego and Los Angeles are too close, aren't they? So the Philippines have gone, it's about a year and a half, more or less, and it's varied a little. It was getting shorter, as a lot of you may know, that 2 or 3 years ago, it took 7 or 8 years for a Filipino nurse to immigrate to the US. But now it only takes about a year and a half to 2 years. In my personal opinion, I think it might be getting about as short as it is going to get. And the reason is, I did the same thing that you did, except not on Facebook Live. I flew up to Sacramento and I gave a seminar outside Sacramento to one of my big hospital chain clients. And they have about 20 hospitals, and almost everybody who asked me a question, it was about that we're short of nurses, what can we do? And of course, the TN is the fastest way to get a foreign-born nurse into the US. But, you know, the hospitals, they have, you know, nurses have questions. Don't feel bad, because the hospitals all have questions about this. Yes. And I was there, I stayed there all day, because between each session, I only gave one session, but each session, a bunch of people would like find me in the back of the room and ask me 3 or 4 more questions. So I think because of that, you're going to see more and more hospitals applying for nurses. They're never going to fill up the 1 million vacant nurse gap by 2020 or 2022. But they will immigrate maybe 10, 20,000 nurses, and a lot of them will be from the Philippines, which will push the waiting times on the visa bulletin back a little bit. Mm-hmm. I don't think back to 7 years right away, but maybe back to 2 years and then to 3 years. So the smartest thing is, if you want to plan ahead, get the visa screen, get the state license, and have somebody petition for permanent residence for you as soon as possible. Because the day that your petition goes in from the employer, that's your place in line. So even if you've worked out an agreement where you're not going to come immediately to the United States, the time is counting. So if they petition you today and you want to come in, you know, a year from now or something like that, well, you know, you're still going to have a wait, but the wait, you'll already have used up a year. So if it's a 2-year wait, you'll have about 1 year left to go before you can come in to the US. And of course, if you're a TN, like I said, you can come in within hours.
Yeah. And I think that the key thing is, you know, we've been doing this for many, many years, as you have. I mean, not as long as you, but we have been doing it for a long time. And certainly we can see a shift in the market, and that there are more and more jobs that are becoming available. So if you are interested, now is the time. Now is the time, if you have not passed your NCLEX, to take your NCLEX. If you need to take your IELTS, if you were not trained in English, now is the time to take the IELTS. And in fact, on that note, I just wanted to mention that Kinetics have a Facebook page. It is completely free on Facebook for nurses who need to pass their IELTS. And we have partnered with a company called Swoosh English, and they're a UK company. They have outstanding results. The UK requirements are higher than the US in terms of the IELTS, and most of their teachers are actually ex-IELTS examiners. So they are a phenomenal company and have agreed to have this free group. So please, if you need to pass the IELTS, or if you know of any of your friends and colleagues that need to pass the IELTS, make use of this. It is completely free. There are pointers and tips. We allocate you a study partner. We have Facebook Live sessions once a week. There are free classes. It really is a phenomenal resource, and we're really very excited to be able to share that with everyone.
That sounds like a great resource, Tanya. I mean, my wife, who's from Cebu, when she hears the word free, she knows that it's a good deal.
Yeah, exactly. Couldn't be a better deal, Carl.
I agree with her.
Okay. So I think we have time for one more question. So we also, I have a question before I've got two questions then. Sure. I think we need to ask the two questions. So one question was on the TN, and it can actually be applicable to a green card as well. This was actually from a nurse that we work with who is wanting to come to the US and has been married in a same-sex marriage, and wanted to know if her partner can come with her, and I'm sure the same would apply to a TN. So how would it work for somebody with that kind of?
So we've had a number of TNs in same-sex marriages, and the spouse, just like if it was two different sexes in the marriage, they get a TD, a trade dependent. That means they can come with their spouse into the US, but they cannot work in the US. So only if they can independently qualify for a TN or some other type of visa can they work. But they can be in the US, they can be on vacation here, they can, they can do whatever they want in the US except be employed. And the same thing happens when they apply for a green card, except if you apply for a green card in the US, which is called adjustment of status, after about 6 months, both parties get a work permit, so the spouse can start working at that point. So it's great. So we have even though it's taking about a year to get an interview for a green card in the US after you apply, your spouse and you will get a work card and a travel card within 6 months. And while you better keep working for the employer who sponsored you, your spouse with their work card, they can work for any employer in the US. They can start their own company. They can quit. They have total freedom. So it's a good deal.
So Carl, I don't know if this is true or not, but I remember somebody telling me once that when there is a same-sex marriage, that it needs to that the nurses need to make sure that it is in a country that recognizes same-sex marriage.
Sure.
Is that
I mean, if you're let's say you're in Saudi Arabia or something, they do not recognize same-sex marriage, so you can't like go and have a religious marriage or something because it's not going to be recognized by the government. So you have to be in a country that will recognize that as a valid marriage. US definitely does, but if you're outside the US, you do have to enter into a valid marriage in order to bring your spouse to the US.
So that's important to bear in mind. We had a question here in the chat box, is the OET accepted or not? And that was from Sibi. Thank you for the question, Sibi. But unfortunately at this stage, it's not accepted in the US. I have heard talks that the CGFNS might be looking at that in the future, because I know that it is accepted, for instance, in the UK. But right now, it's either the IELTS and the TOEFL. And most nurses these days, in my experience, take the IELTS because they say I'm not sure, but they say it's a little easier. So we really pretty much focus more on the IELTS. So the last question that I have for today is a question, it's not actually a TN about the TN, but it's if a nurse is on an H1B visa, working in a specialty area, of course, because we know now, for learning from you, Carl, that only nurses that are in a specialty area would qualify for the H1. But if that person is on an H1 and was born in the Philippines, does not have a previous petition, and is sponsored by another hospital for a green card, how long would it take for that nurse to be able to start working at the second hospital.
Okay, let me make sure I understand it. The nurse has been had an H-1B approved for Hospital 1?
Yes.
And did the nurse work for Hospital 1?
And it's here working, but that hospital will not do green cards.
Ah, I see. So so she's asking about transferring from Hospital 1 to Hospital 2, or
no?
Okay,
so
I'm
it's
sorry.
not an H1 transfer. No, that's okay. And that's where we've got to get the facts straight. It's not an H1 transfer. So this nurse, because she's at a hospital where they won't do green cards at this stage, she is looking for a petitioner that will sponsor her for the green card.
Right.
And the new Hospital B, Hospital 2, doesn't is not looking to take her on as an H1 transfer. So it will just be doing a green card, an adjustment of status green card.
Okay, and she wants to know whether that's possible to do that?
Number one, is that possible?
Yes.
And number two, if the nurse was born in the Philippines, does not have a previous petition, how long before that? Because obviously there's still a backlog with Philippines. How long before that nurse would be able to get her EAD card and go work at the at Hospital 2?
So if she's in the EB3 category, there's presently about a 1.5 year backlog.
Okay.
So, I mean, the usual case is that the Hospital 2 will do H-1Bs, and because it's, the first H-1B, unless it's a university or some nonprofit research or something, is subject to an 85,000 cap. And we just got an H-1B in the cap for one of our nurses with a bachelor's degree. I mean, it doesn't happen all the time, but yeah, it did. And once the nurse goes through the cap, when she switches employers, she's not under the cap anymore. And when employer number 2 files a new H-1 petition, as soon as the receipt comes from the Immigration Service, which takes a few weeks at the most, the nurse can do the transfer. And that's what we usually do.
Yes.
But if hospital number 2, for whatever reason, does not want to do the H-1B sponsorship, right now, if they were going to put in a petition for the nurse, I would say they will have to wait between 1.5 years and 2 years for the priority date to become current. And then if the nurse is going to adjust status in the United States, another 6 months until she gets a work card. If she's going to go back to the Philippines and get the green card, then the whole thing should be between 18 and 24 months, which is, I can't speak to why the hospital wouldn't want to do the H-1B, but if, because most of our hospitals would be glad to do the H-1B because they can get the nurse, they want to get the nurse as quickly as possible. Yeah. But if there's some reason they don't want to do that, then figure around 2 years before the nurse can start working for them. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
We are out of time.
Okay.
I can't believe how quickly that went. Well, thank you, Carl, for your time. That was very informative.
Thank you, Tanya.
I think that is really most of the questions that we had for the TN. So at our next session, we'll be speaking about other topics, which will be announced beforehand, so everybody will know what's coming. Please keep sending us your questions. We have had lots of questions from many of you, and we're very, very happy to go through your questions on these Facebook Live sessions. So please continue to send us questions. We also have a very exciting announcement that is going to be made in the beginning of November. So please watch out and wait for that big announcement, which is very exciting. And just to mention that next week, we will not be having our regular Friday Facebook Live. As I am traveling, I'm going to be on the East Coast seeing some of our clients. But the following week, it will be Facebook Live as usual.
I will be in Peru the next.
Oh, yes, I forgot. Sorry, Carl. I forgot. So we're going to have a little bit of a wait. Carl, I'm traveling for work. But Carl is traveling for fun.
Well, hey, I'm speaking to immigration lawyers in Lima in the middle of the
It's a
month.
combination.
But I'm going to have a little fun before that.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so we will let you know when we will be resuming. It will be in November, and we do have an exciting announcement then. So stay tuned and keep sending us your questions, and have a great weekend, everybody.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Carl. Bye-bye.